Hello guys, I hope that you're doing great. Today we're going to continue with the explanations of the different topics from the book Grammar and Beyond. Last week we talked about comparatives and superlatives. We talked about their difference, how they are used, and the different rules that they have. We talked that two comparatives are normally used to talk about two objects and their difference that they have. Like for example, if I have two markers, how would I compare them and what are the differences they had regarding or the difference in, for example, quality, characteristics, and many other stuff. Today, as you see over here on the screen, we're going to focus on superlatives, adjectives, and adverbs as well. Remember, always keep that in mind that a superlative, in this case, when we're talking about an adjective, is used to compare, remember what? Two objects, people, animals. We are always going to use them to compare nouns. As on the case of adverbs, they are always going to be used to compare the things that we are, well, the actions in this case, and how are we doing those actions. But without further ado, let's jump to the explanation and let's see why are the different rules and how we should follow them. Okay, so we're going to start with the first rule and how we use superlative adjectives and adverbs. Remember, adjectives and adverbs are different, therefore the rules are going to be different as well. First, when we have superlative adjectives and adverbs, compare one idea to other idea. They mean more or less than all of the others. So it is important to remember this, more or less than all of the others. When we're talking about superlatives, we're talking about ideas that they don't have any comparison in the word. That means that they are unique, or they are the best of something, or they are the worst of something. And you don't have something to compare. It's not the same like when I have these two markers, and probably they can be comparable because they have similar characteristics or things that make them really equal to one another. In the case of a superlative, that is not the case. I can say that one is the best or one is the worst. For example, social networking sites are the newest way to communicate after a disaster. They are the newest way. Now you can see through your phone, like for example, when there is an earthquake, when there is a hurricane or something, you can type to someone else and let them know that you are okay. Probably this was one of the most controversial features that was added to a social network recently, but it's something that is the newest feature that we have to communicate after a natural disaster or something similar to this one. There is no other way that is as new as this one because there is no other type of technology that has been created that can surpass or can substitute this kind of devices that we normally use to communicate with one another. Therefore, that's why they are the newest. Let's focus on the following, and we have, in this case, when we talk about the newest, we're talking about an adjective because we are describing or giving a characteristic to the networking sites. On the other case, the city of New Orleans was hit the hardest. Remember that when we talk about an adverb, we're talking about the way in which the action is happening. And in this case, the city of New Orleans was hit the hardest. We're talking about the way in which New Orleans was hit. Probably you have New York, and New York was not hit as hard as New Orleans was. And she's the one that has, well, I say she, but this city is the one that has a lot of damage and most damage of it all. Therefore, we can say that it was hit the hardest because no other losses or no other damage can compare to the one that New Orleans suffered. Now, when we talk about the structure, it's really simple to follow. First, you just need a subject, the verb, the word that is important. When we talk about comparatives, we are always going to use the article that because that is a definite article that in this case is telling us that the object that we are talking about is unique and doesn't belong to any category and nothing can compare to it. Superlative adjective that we're going to see some of them, and then you have any complement in this part that doesn't have anything. We have a subject, for example, in this case, the hurricane. The hurricane is a subject. It's a natural disaster. We know how to use them. Was. So the verb in this case can be the present, past, or you can use an auxiliary plus the future tense. You have the article that, remember, it's important and it's essential to have it. The superlative adjective that is in this case the biggest storm of the season. The hurricane was the biggest storm of the season. This means that in this season, probably there were 5 hurricanes, but this one was the biggest. There's one other that is comparable to its size, its power, its level of destruction. Therefore, in this case, we're talking about the biggest hurricane. Or we can say it's the most expensive storm of the season. You may see expensive, but how does the word expensive fit with this structure or with this sentence? I mean, I use the word expensive when I talk about objects, and I can say, this cell phone is expensive, my headphones are expensive. But with a hurricane, that means when we're talking about expensive in this regard, we're saying that this hurricane caused a lot of damage, monetary damage, probably to the houses, to the local business, and to the things in general that they need to be paid in order to recover from the economical impact. But let's see some examples. Or the least damaging. That in this case, we're talking about that a hurricane that didn't damage that much of the country or of the city. In this case, probably he just appeared, did some damage, but not as much as any other hurricane this season. When we have superlative adverbs, remember that we are describing the action in this case. We have the next one that is rescuers, that is the people who are in charge of rescuing other people when they are in when a natural disaster has happened and they are looking for survivors and people who need medical treatment. Then we have the verb, they worked. Rescuers worked. As well, we can use any verb, either present, past, or future. All that, remember, important, superlative adverb. Rescuers worked the hardest. Nobody worked as hard as them because they were over there moving all the debris, they were rescuing people, they were doing stuff, and they were working here and there. Therefore, they didn't work, they worked as hard as nobody else did. And then right after the disaster, just since we're talking about hurricanes, let's suppose that there was a category 5 hurricane that is a really devastating one. And when this happens, if there is a lot of damage, they were working there. Nobody worked as hard as them, not even the authorities, not even the police, but they were there playing with their lives and trying to get people out of the different places that they were. Continue. Then we have another examples like rescues work the most quickly right after the disaster, okay? Or the least efficiently. That means that were other groups of people helping and they were the less efficient of all. But now let's focus on the uses of this structure and the different rules that we should follow. First, when we are forming superlatives, adjectives, and adverbs, we need to add at the end of the word or at the end of the adjective or adverb, est, to one-syllable adjectives. Remember that when we were talking about comparatives, we said in a word summary, when you have one-syllable adjectives and adverbs, you use add er. If you had two-syllable adjectives and then normally end in y, you change the y for an I and then you add er. And when you have two or more syllable adjectives, you add more to compare or less to compare something in a negative way. So in this case, add the est to one-syllable adjectives and adverbs. One syllable. How do you know it is in one syllable? I mentioned it in the past video, the pronunciation. That is going to let you know if it is 1, 2, 3, or 4 syllables. For example, fast will become the fastest. Hard will become the hardest. Strong will become the strongest. For adjectives that end in a vowel plus consonant, double the consonant. Remember, if you have the pattern of a word that ends in a vowel plus a consonant at the end, you double that consonant and you add est at the end. We're going to see some examples. Big become the biggest, for example. Why? Because you have the pattern, a vowel that is I and a consonant that is G. Then you double the consonant and then est at the end. Hot becomes the hottest, and we can mention many others as well. Remove the Y and add IEST to two-syllable adjectives ending in Y. The same rules as the comparatives. Really simple to follow because we have busy will become the busiest. Or we're going to have early will become the earliest. Notice that all the adjectives and adverbs are using the particle that at the beginning. It is important to always use it and to always keep it there. If not, we cannot use superlatives correctly. Heavy will become the heaviest. The most with use the most with almost all adjectives that have more than 2 syllables and with adverbs ending in ly. So remember, in this case, it is important to remember this key detail. When the adverb or the adjectives ends just in y, normally you're going to change the y for iest. But there are some cases in which the adverb or the adjectives ends in ly, but in this case, we're just going to add more and most. Well, most, since we're not talking about comparatives, but superlatives, you just add most. We're going to see the example. Expensive. How do you know that expensive had more than 2 syllables? Pronounce it. You say expensive. Clearly, we have 3 syllables. Therefore, we need to use the word most before that. We have the particle that, as always, then you have most, and then you have expensive. Here, remember the adverb or the adjective that we're using is not going to change at all. That's why you're using the word most, and that means that you don't need to add est after that. Frequent will become frequently in this case. So we will have the most frequently. Some superlatives, adjectives, and adverbs are irregular. This means, as you remember when we were talking about comparatives, that they have their own forms. Therefore, they are going to change in different ways when they are using this form. For example, adjectives like good will become the best, or in this case of bad, they will become the worst. Therefore, that is the way in which they are going to change. There is no way or there's no rule to determine what do you need to do to determine if they are going to be regular or irregular. The best way to do it is by memorizing them and learning it by heart. In that way, you're going to avoid being confused about the different use of these kinds of adjectives and adverbs. So then when you have the adverb as well will become the best, or badly will become the worst. Let's focus on the other uses as well. We have superlative adjectives show that a noun has the most or least of a certain quality. They compare one noun to other nouns in a group. So we have the more or the least in certain quality. So here we're talking about quality, and we normally talk quality when we talk about products or different things or objects that we want to compare. They compare one noun to another one in another group. Let's look at an example. It was the biggest forest fire in the state, biggest forest fire. Compare one forest fire to all of the states. As I was explaining at the beginning, we're comparing one of the forest fires, many of them that have happened probably during the week, during the month, during the year. Superlative adverbs show that a verb happens in the most or least in a certain way. They compare one action or situation to another group. So in this case, as when we were talking about comparatives, we're comparing two actions in different ways. For example, that group worked hardest or worked most efficiently after the disaster. Worked most efficiently compares the way the group worked and all the way in which the other groups worked. So in this case, let's imagine that we had eight groups of rescue, but just one was the one that works the hardest. Probably they worked more than 8 hours. They were working nonstop, and they were taking even their breaks to work. Therefore, they were the most efficiently because they rescue more people and they help to save more people in danger in that situation. The least or plus an adjective or adverb is the opposite of the most plus an adjective or adverb. What is the meaning of this? That means that if you are talking about the least interesting stuff, you're talking about the thing that interests you the least, that it doesn't have any value at all. But if you're talking about the most interesting movie that you have seen, we're talking about a movie that in this case is the most important of all. The storm was the least dangerous one of the season. This wasn't much damage from it. So in this case, that means that there were other storms in the season, but this was the least dangerous. That means it didn't have a lot of danger at all. The least is not usually used with one syllable adjectives and adverbs. So that means my daughter is the youngest of my children, or my daughter is the least old of my children. You see that in this case, the construction, the least old, doesn't fit at all. That's why in this case, least is not usually used with one syllable adjectives. Just a reminder, one syllable equals that we are not going to use least or more. Therefore, we're going to use the expression the youngest. You don't need to repeat the word after the superlative when the meaning is clear. Like when we saw with comparatives, the disaster was the biggest, or the disaster in this case was the biggest disaster to appear. It doesn't matter. You don't need to add anything else to compare. We normally add a group or the things that we're comparing to be more specific, but in this case, it's not necessarily needed, and it's something that probably you shouldn't use that much. All of the technologies we use, this is the easiest. Okay, this is the easiest. That means that you're comparing all of the things you have. Probably you have a computer, a projector, a platform, a different application, a device, etc. But this is the easiest that you use. Let's continue with the explanation. So now that we know about the use, we're going to finish with the using superlatives over here. So you can identify the group being compared with. A prepositional phrase, in and of are the most common prepositions. So in this case, for example, I can say, Gerardo is the most intelligent student in this classroom. I'm talking about the place to which I'm comparing. That's why it is important sometimes to determine or to specify where are you comparing, to whom are you comparing, or what category are you comparing. It was the worst storm, it was the worst storm in many years, probably 5, 10 years, there was no storm like this one. A possessive form, like a possessive pronoun or noun, you do not need the a before the superlative when you use possessiveness. For example, today's newest technologies help us during disaster. Newest technologies. When we're talking about the possessive case, if you remember, that is adding an S plus an apostrophe, that means that we can have an adjective, in this case, in the superlative form. Our biggest problem was raising relief money. Remember, like a possessive pronoun or noun, you do not need the da before the superlative. That means that when you have a possessive pronoun, in this case, we're talking about the possessive case, or possessive pronoun per se, like our, my, your, etc., you don't need to add the word da. The word da is normally going to be used when you're comparing the other way around, when you're comparing after the verb. But if you are giving a characteristic to something, therefore, you don't need to add the da. You can use one of the or some of the before a superlative adjective. It's one of the best ways to communicate quickly. We're talking about one of. In this case, you're talking about that there are many, many ways in which you can communicate that are really efficient, and this is just one of them. In this case, we're talking about the superlative way that we have like a premium category of something, but we're just using one. Use a plural noun or a noun count noun with this expression. There are some of the most interesting new technologies. Some. In this case, probably there are more interesting new technologies, but we are referring just to a couple of them. And with that, we're going to end the explanation. So if you remember, really easy to remember, one syllable adjectives and adverbs, just add est. Two syllable adjectives and adverbs that end in y, just change the y for I and add est. If you have two or more syllable adjectives and adverbs, you are, in this case, most or least, and you don't change the verb whatsoever. Remember that adding the word that is important after the verb when you are talking about superlatives, but when you're not talking about superlatives after the verb and you're using it after a pronoun or a possessive case, therefore you don't need to add that. And remember, it is important to use the superlatives to talk about the best in quality or the worst in quality. And with that, we're going to finish the explanation over here. So if you have any question, let me know and I will answer them to you on the Google Classroom platform. Remember that this video is available for you at any time. You can watch it as many times as you want if you haven't understood anything. And with that, I will leave you and I will see you until next week. Take care, bye-bye, and God bless you all.